I know you're probably thinking, what else could she possibly squeeze out of this series to theorize about? Well, buddy, you must be brand new around here. And if so, welcome. But if you're not, you knew this video was coming at some point or another. One of the most iconic but least talked about aspects of Kane Pixel's Backrooms series is the low proximity magnetic distortion system, which is honestly a crime because the thought and effort put into the machine and the science behind it should earn it the discussion that it deserves. So, without any further ado, let's get into what exactly the low proximity magnetic distortion system is, how it works, and see if we can't use it to figure out how null zones work.
In the coming decades, we must account for these never-before-faced challenges in ways equally never-before considered. Here at Async, we believe we have found the solution. The low-proximity magnetic distortion system. What is the low-proximity magnetic distortion system?
This is a bit of a complicated question, as while the general answer of the low proximity magnetic distortion system being some kind of fusion reactor is seemingly an open and shut answer, it doesn't explain how it functions or what about it made it overload and hurt Ivan. If you're not familiar with my previous theory videos, don't worry about it. It's been a bit since I initially referenced the low proximity magnetic distortion system and the science behind it, but my initial guess and speculation, and again, none of this is explicitly confirmed by Kane, this is all my speculation and the community's, was that the low proximity magnetic distortion system is a type of fusion reactor that Ivan was trying to build.
See, aside from Ivan being something of a scientist himself, he also seems to be an environmentalist, as he may have been working with General Electric or alongside them during the 70s in an effort to achieve fusion energy. During the events of Overflow, you can hear the radio in the background discuss the SALT agreements, and those talks were intended to limit the presence of nuclear arms and missiles from both the US and Russia, as well as halt the general use of nuclear energy in weapons.
So we speculated the United States began to secretly pivot to using nuclear energy as a source of renewable power instead, and Ivan would get to be a part of that research and development, which, when you think about the scientific advancements that were happening at the time, it's not unlikely that the United States would have begun to pivot to renewable energy. Funny enough, the method Ivan ended up working on was initially established for work on nuclear weapons before the pivot to renewable energy.
So, Ivan, studying fusion and nuclear physics, would end up building the very first iteration of what we would come to know as the low proximity magnetic distortion system. In Overflow, you can see a bunch of his notes and results on the prior tests that him and his team conducted in the days leading up to August 4th. These results seemingly show the ideal composition for the target fuel, which is what we all know as the marble from Prototype. There also appears to be instructions on how to construct the low proximity magnetic distortion system behind these experiment findings, which, while hard to make out, can be better seen once the green light floods the room. And if you look closely just before it gets too incoherent, you can see it discusses connecting things, windings, calculating the efficiency, output, and using transformers.
Transformers are another major clue here that will help us understand and explain just what went so wrong for Ivan that night, especially Optimus Prime. No, but really, keep that in mind.
So, what type of fusion reactor was Ivan building? What exactly is the low proximity magnetic distortion system? Well, the inclusion of Ivan using target fuel is a major hint as to what kind of a reactor it is, and I believe that it is an inertial confinement fusion reactor.
There's also quite a bit of supplementary real-life connections to support this, like the PALS laser facility in the Czech Republic being established to research inertial confinement fusion laser implosions. Granted, it happened in 2004, but it's still a neat connection to Ivan given his home country is the Czech Republic. There's also the fact that to produce net energy in ICF reactions, and, well, any fusion reaction really, you need to achieve ignition.
This is done by squeezing the materials to a hot and dense condition for a long period of time. However, the major problem is that after a plasma becomes hot, it becomes hard to compress. So scientists avoid getting the material hot until after the compression happens. This method is known as the low adiabatic approach to compression and is outlined in 3 steps. The first step is to keep the plasma very cold and squeeze it together. The second step is to heat the plasma only after it is squeezed, ideally inside what's known as a hot spot, which in the case of the low proximity magnetic distortion system that we know today would probably be the distortion plate. But when it comes to the prototype, it would be this middle section where the marble, aka the target fuel, would be. Once fusion happens, the resulting products deposit their energy, creating more fusion. Several compression approaches attempt to do this and are known as central hotspot ignition, fast ignition, shock ignition, and magneto-inertial fusion. Magneto-inertial fusion, which is also known as magnetized target fusion, uses magnetic fields to confine an initially warm, low-density plasma and then compresses that plasma to fusion conditions using an impulse driver, or a liner. The plasma's conductivity prevents it from crossing magnetic field lines, and further compressing the target amplifies the magnetic field. As such, the magnetic field reduces particle transport, and the field insulates the target from the liner. But an additional detail that many people, including me, have overlooked is that one section which begins to describe how the low proximity magnetic distortion system works before it's censored and cut off.
What is the low proximity magnetic distortion system? Using 32...
The section that is cut off here is actually hiding the words refinery components. Refinery components refer to a set of systems designed to recover, recycle, refine, and recirculate the isotopes needed for the fusion reaction.
Essentially, it would create its own renewable energy in order for it to achieve the reaction needed for ignition, further supporting the idea that at the very minimum, the low proximity magnetic distortion system is a type of fusion reactor. But let's continue to discuss what exactly inertial confinement fusion is and how it relates to the low proximity magnetic distortion system. How many times do you have to say low proximity magnetic distortion system? Several times, apparently.
Inertial confinement fusion, or ICF, is defined as a fusion energy process that initiates nuclear fusion reactions by compressing and heating targets filled with fuel. The targets are small pellets, typically containing deuterium and tritium. We know that arsenic telluride and arsenic triselenide were mentioned in the notes, but from the research into these compounds I've done, as well as the contents of the notes themselves, it seems like that was the composition for the chamber that holds the target fuel. You can even see here the notes mention that the dielectric properties of this glass system compare favorably to other samples like yttrium garnets, silicon, or aluminum antimonide. Arsenic telluride is an inorganic compound of arsenic and tellurium, with the chemical formula As2Te3. It exists in 2 forms, one of which is the monoclinic alpha phase, which transforms under high pressure to a rhombohedral beta phase. Arsenic telluride is a semiconductor, and as such, this compound has been examined for its use in nonlinear optics.
This is all important to mention because in normal ambient pressure, arsenic telluride yields a monoclinic structure with low thermoelectric properties.
However, when placed in high-pressure environments, like in a fusion reactor, it transforms into the beta configuration that is described as a rhombohedral R3M space group with high thermoelectric properties.
This is especially important because it tells us that one of the compounds used in the glass system of the low proximity magnetic distortion system target fuel chamber is noted for having high thermoelectric properties, which would in turn help Ivan achieve fusion ignition.
Arsenic triselenide is an inorganic chemical compound with the chemical formula As2Se3 and is used as a chalcogenide glass for infrared optics. When this compound is purified, it transmits light with wavelengths between 0.7 and 19 micrometers. I believe this to be very significant because this is the infrared wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum.
If you're new here, you should know that the electromagnetic spectrum and I go way back in my videos. I practically geeked out over green light in my first theory video, and I still do love green light, but green isn't the only color we see frequently in the series.
See, we have areas like the Red City and the Red Neighborhood, which are not only among our largest areas in the complex so far, but they're also the only outdoors-looking areas that we've seen thus far. I mean, the Red Neighborhood looked convincing enough that Marvin even wondered aloud whether he had wandered through a null zone.
What? Are those streetlights? Streetlights. The left hallway, and it's right there, under the gap in the wall.
You need to stay at the hole. George will be back any minute, then we can assess the situation from there.
But what if Miller's right about the null zones?
Ravi didn't seem to process the area that he was in too well either.
Which is heartbreaking because if there was a tunnel at the end of the road in the Red City that would eventually lead to the Red Neighborhood, he could have had a decent chance of being rescued by Async. Or being eaten by Marvin's friend, but that's a whole other topic. That's a whole other can of worms.
I believe this red light is meant to represent the infrared band of the electromagnetic spectrum, especially since we see Marvin's radio acting up in the Red Neighborhood, and the radio and infrared bands are pretty close to each other as is, which explains the potential for radio interference like we heard when the police radio transmission in Found Footage 3, which mentions an infraction code of failing to stop at a stop sign, something we also saw in front of the green light hallway after Ravi runs away from still life. Of course, we also have the green light, which would correspond to the visible light band of the electromagnetic spectrum, and is something we've discussed quite a bit of already on this channel.
By the way, I feel very vindicated about being right that the green light is tied to the expansion and active changing of the complex.
But we also have appearances of blue light, which is exclusively seen when something time-related happens, like the backwards messages that imply the narrator knows what will happen in that specific section. The message from presentation, for example, comes to mind, where it states that Async's presentation was meant to deceive the federal government. Or when Peter had his time skip incident and you see the light around him blue shift as he moves forward 2.5 months into the future. I believe this blue light corresponds to the ultraviolet band of the electromagnetic spectrum.
But why did I take the time to mention all of this? Well, we know that there's a ton of sun imagery and references in the series, both in the videos themselves with the sun portraits, the sunset in the autopsy report TV, Ravi's name being a reference to the name of the Egyptian sun god Ra, and of course the solar flare being one of the major contributing factors to Ivan's connection to the complex in the first place. But there's a smaller connection that I didn't even realize until I was actually doing my research for this script.
See, sunlight itself is composed of near-thermal spectrum radiation that is slightly more than half infrared. At solar noon, when the sun is at the highest point in the sky, sunlight provides an irradiance of just over 1 kilowatt per square meter at sea level. Of this energy, 527 watts is infrared radiation, which is felt by us as heat, 445 watts is visible light, and 32 watts is ultraviolet radiation. Nearly all of the infrared radiation in sunlight is near infrared, which is shorter than 4 micrometers. I believe this detail explains why red, green, and blue are the major colors we see when dealing with any sort of event or phenomenon within or related to the complex. Because of the inherent connection to the sun and the way sunlight behaves in our atmosphere, it would make sense that the outdoor areas would be bathed in red light, especially if we're to assume that the red light is meant to represent sunlight.
Not to mention the song Kane covered called Red Sun in the Sky, but you know, science helps me illustrate my point better. You may be wondering then, why is the Red Neighborhood bathed in red light if our own sun doesn't do that? Well, it does, but you just can't see it.
If you recall events like wildfires where there's tons of smoke and soot in the atmosphere, you'll remember those haunting pictures where it quite literally looked like someone was in hell. The hills were on fire, the sky was blood red, the sun looked like it was red, and as you might have guessed, the sun only looks red due to its positioning in the sky or because of atmospheric conditions that can block sunlight, i.e. the forest fires that I just mentioned. More specifically, the phenomenon behind light scattering is known as Rayleigh scattering. It's why our sky changes colors in the dawn, day, evening, and nighttime. Electromagnetic waves have different wavelengths, and the longer a wavelength is, the less energy it has to penetrate a boundary like the atmosphere. The shorter a wavelength is, on the other hand, the more energy it has, which explains why, even though the ultraviolet waves are much shorter than radio and infrared waves, they're the ones that are able to actually penetrate the atmosphere and scatter color for most of the day. As the sun lowers, those longer wavelengths become able to better penetrate the atmosphere. This is just a side note, but I think this is also why sunsets can look vastly different in other areas of the country. Like, compare a coastal sunset to a mountainous sunset, for example, and you'll see what I mean.
Okay, sorry, that was my tangent on the sun and how cool it is.
I also wanted to point out the sticky note here, which, while seems to be more of a placeholder for something, it does feature a lot of 7s, and the number 7 is a very prominent reoccurring motif in the series that connects to both Ivan and the complex.
I think it's crucial to note because if you're going off of the symbolic association of things, then the number 7 would represent perfection and completeness. In fact, many cultures value the number 7 for its luck and supposed magical properties. I mean, I think I'd call accidentally using a solar flare's particle shower to establish a quantum entanglement between my dimension and another one to be magical, but I mean, that's just me, I don't know.
Anyway, we know that something happened during the experiment which caused Ivan's machine to go haywire and somehow ended up hurting him, causing post-traumatic amnesia and later retrograde amnesia. But that's not all the accident did. At the beginning and ending of Overflow, you can see a shot of the night sky, and on first glance, you may not notice some of the differences between them. But once you do, however, the first thing you'll realize is that the orientation of the sky is different. The ending of Overflow shows an upside-down night sky, almost like you were looking at the sky through a reflection casted on the surface of a lake or a pond. You'll also see the lower left corner of the video has a slight rotating effect that was not present in the beginning. Additionally, you can hear car horns that also weren't present in the beginning of the video. However, you can hear wind chimes in the beginning of the video.
The trade between market and non-market economies. Well, as I've said, that
These shots have always stood out to me, mainly because these differences don't make themselves apparent until after Ivan's accident.
Not to mention, as time goes on in the series, you can see how much more drastic this inversion and distortion effect becomes, especially as it focuses on async as a whole in I Remember. To cite an actual folder on my PC that is called Kane Said, Kane once said that we may have already seen a video that's closer to the ending of the series, and I personally think that this is I Remember. Not only because I feel like Kane is not above putting answers in plain sight, but also because of what I mentioned earlier of how severe these effects differ from Overflow versus I Remember.
There's also the title itself being more of a hint that I Remember is meant to take place more towards the end of the series and is meant to be from Ivan's point of view. So I believe these specific shots are meant to imply the drastic change Ivan's accident caused, not just for him, but seemingly for all of reality, as this is the moment where Standard and the Complex became entangled, or rather, Ivan and the Complex became entangled if we want to get into specifics.
We know that Ivan seemingly ends up with post-traumatic amnesia thanks to the Out of Sync track featuring the same title, and one of the possible complications of post-traumatic amnesia is retrograde amnesia, something that has been hinted at through elements of retrograde melodies and motifs used in Kane's music for the series, and of course, Ivan seemingly not being able to remember much from before his accident.
Now, most people would ideally not get involved in further experiments as to avoid the risk of getting into another accident that could end up taking their lives. But as we've established, Ivan is not most people.
So, Ivan and Async perfect his machine up until the current iteration of the low proximity magnetic distortion system that we see, which is designated as the KV31 threshold, and eventually they make first contact with the complex on October 17th, 1989. This is a monumental event, and And while Kane said that the earthquake did not cause the threshold to open, it seems like it was the other way around. I think that the vast amount of energy it took to open a stable gateway into the complex was the reason for the Loma Prieta earthquake that occurred shortly after the machine was turned on.
But what was it about the energy of both Overflow and First Contact that not only caused such drastic effects to Ivan, but the rest of Standard? Why did I highlight the Transformers as being something to keep in mind for Overflow? Where does it all tie in? How many more questions could I possibly ask? Well, here's what I and the community have been thinking.
Overflow wasn't just a significant date in terms of the accident that hurt Ivan and caused his memory loss. There was also a massive solar flare and coronal mass ejection that played a major role in the events of Overflow and the very connection to the complex. An important thing to note about solar events like flares and coronal mass ejections is that they can begin and last for days on end. So while their start date may vary from the date in an event in the story, their peak effects do end up coinciding with the events in the story.
Yeah, y'all know what time it is. It's heliophysics time with Red.
So, the solar storm that happened on August 4th in the story wasn't just a fictional event. It was a very real solar event whose energy and power rivaled that of the Carrington event, a major solar storm that occurred in 1812 that fried telegraph lines, shocked telephone operators, caused power lines to blow, and even resulted in northern lights, or aurora borealis, being seen as far down as Texas.
Which I'm high-key jealous of because I've always wanted to see the northern lights. Did you guys know that they can get loud? Because I didn't. Anyway, before I get lost on a tangent again, we need to talk about the effects of the 1972 solar storm.
One thing I wanted to note for those who may be asking is how we know a solar event played a major role in Ivan's accident. And it's due to the reoccurring solar imagery, prototype imagery, as well as common depictions of Ivan having his face censored with a photograph taken of the sun during the August 4th solar storm from the Paris Observatory, thus insinuating a direct connection between the overall events of Overflow, Ivan, and the solar storm. With that out of the way, let's talk about how powerful these events can get. I already described the Carrington event and the various effects that it had on Earth, but there's a specific term for those effects, and those are known as ground level enhancements, ground level effects, or GLEs for short. These are a special subset of solar particle event where charged particles from the sun have sufficient energy to generate effects which can be measured at the Earth's surface. Typically, the particles from the sun don't have the necessary energy to permeate the atmosphere and reach the ground level, but when they're charged due to a solar flare or coronal mass ejection, for example, they can gain the energy to penetrate that barrier and cause an air shower, which then results in measurable effects here on Earth. These can include issues with electronics, phone lines, and if it's powerful enough, can even do things like detonate magnetic sea mines as seen in Vietnam during the solar event from August 4th in 1972. You starting to see what I'm getting at? The event in 1972 was very powerful indeed, and another event similar to it occurred in 2012. And although the flare narrowly missed us, it still gave us a lot of information about it.
That 2012 flare would definitely have had Carrington-like effects. And I don't know about you, but if that were to happen again, I think the fallout now would be drastically different than it was 200 years ago. I mean, we have tons of satellites now. You want them to be absolutely fried and be left with no communication or internet or GPS? We got lucky, if I'm being honest. Now that I say this, I wonder if that's what the Mayan calendar was predicting. A devastating solar flare that plunged the world into darkness. But back to 1972.
The event in 1972, as you now know, did end up producing GLEs, and one of the most likely GLEs that would have directly impacted Ivan was an overload to the local power grid, and all the transformers he was using that night, no doubt. Not to mention, those particles 100% affected the Earth's magnetosphere, which probably affected the more localized magnetic field regions of the planet as well. I believe the overload of the grid and the manipulation of the magnetic fields may have caused such a drastic result in his experiment.
Now, this is an out there thought, but we know that Ivan gets hurt, and it's implied that he's blind in one eye as a result of this accident. We also know that Ivan and his team were running experiments on the composition of the target fuel for the low proximity magnetic distortion system. Could his target fuel have arced since there was an overflow of energy? More specifically, I visualized it looking like what we see in the third test.
Here, when Ivan and his team turn the low proximity magnetic distortion system on, you can see the plasma getting brighter. You can also see it arc towards the camera for a split second as it becomes unstable and separates. What if that's what Ivan saw? Only instead of a door, it looked a little something like this? I swear, this is my favorite image to use whenever I talk about overflow. But I think this is how Ivan ended up getting hurt. Perhaps the plasma arced due to the overflow of energy, and the resulting damage led to blindness in one eye and memory loss. Bro was basically electrocuted and fried like in the cartoons. This is also how the connection between Ivan and the complex was established in the first place, as it seems like Ivan is a sort of anchor for the complex as it integrates into standard. We know the phrase, "you have always been here," is a common thing that is connected to Ivan, but it's never really stated why.
I personally think it's some sort of paradox where the complex exists only because Ivan made it exist somehow. But because Ivan exists, the complex has therefore always existed. You see what I mean? I know paradoxes aren't meant to be easy, but I hope you get what I was trying to convey.
Now, comparing Overflow to First Contact, you'll see a lot of obvious differences. For one, Ivan now has a team and a whole-ass research institute at his Ivan beck and call, but he also has government funding behind him that helped him build the current iteration of the low proximity magnetic distortion system and continue research into it later on in the series. Not only that, but instead of a small pellet in a chamber, Ivan now has an entire distortion plate, which is coated in the necessary materials to initiate that reaction he's aiming for. He also has the luxury of being in an observation deck where he won't get shocked by arcing plasma again, and we see in the third test that it was 1,000,000% a valuable investment. By the time First Contact rolls around, we've seen that the research team has made some minor adjustments and modifications to their system, and we also see this quick screen flash by, which is actually a code that designates the highest particle multiplicity possible in particle accelerators during collision events.
Which is a not so subtle hint that tells us, hey, remember how much power went into what Ivan did in Overflow? Yeah, he's doing it again.
So, we see all these added radio frequency cavities, generators, and other censored stuff, and then it happens. Notice how there's a person who insisted the machine stay on? I still wonder if that was Ivan, but pay attention to the timing between the threshold opening and the earthquake. The earthquake comes a bit after the threshold turns on.
Why is this, you may be wondering? Was there really that much energy going into the low proximity magnetic distortion system? Well, you may have noticed I left out a very crucial part of the low proximity magnetic distortion system, and that's the magnetic distortion part. See, the whole thing with electromagnetism is that it isn't just about energy and electricity, it's about magnetic fields. Fields which can be generated, manipulated, and condensed. So when the machine turns on and the plasma heats up, I believe that an immense amount of pressure causes the electromagnetic field to compress and then possibly separate or just rip itself apart.
Pay attention to how the plasma ignites in the distortion plate and compare that to this scene you're about to see from Overflow. it's very similar, if not identical. Now compare the way it ignited in the third test. The differences imply that there was either not enough pressure to condense the plasma and the magnetic field, or that it was lacking power to do it in a much slower and calculated way like what we see in first contact. Or it could be both. The third test has the plasma seemingly falling apart, while Overflow and first contact have a slower and even appearance of plasma ignition and separation. So, with this much careful and sustained pressure and heat, it's no shock that it sent out seismic disturbances that may have triggered the fault lines to move as a result, which led to the Loma Prieta earthquake.
It's also why the community and I theorize that if Async and Ivan were to build another, much wider threshold, like what they mentioned in presentation, then it would lead to some pretty devastating effects for Async, mainly a fire. That, and Kane has said that he believes if scientists were to attempt this experiment now, that it would more than likely just cause a huge fire, so I don't know.
There was also a real-life theory that stated whether magnetic field disturbances could be measured before an earthquake happened, citing magnetic field disturbances measured shortly before the Loma Prieta earthquake, and while further research suggests that it was more of an anomaly than anything else, it's fun to think that Kane actually made that theory real in his series, and that by disturbing the magnetic fields during first contact, it caused the earthquake.
So we should talk about the one thing that I haven't really mentioned, and that's the null zones. What are they and why are they so important? Why are they theorized to be the reason for the gap in the wall in the red neighborhood? Let's dive right in, shall we?
Null zones, probably one of my favorite concepts from Kane's Backrooms series, is something that still has a ton of mystery surrounding it. For one, we should establish a solid theory as to what these null zones are, and I can now say with confidence that I believe null zones are, in fact, a way to slip in or out of the complex. Unstable null zones cause space-time displacement, while stable null zones do not. How do you know what is a stable null zone versus an unstable one? Well, I'll give you a hint. We only have one stable null zone in and out of the complex so far, and it's the threshold. It seems to be the one and only stable null zone that we know of in the series. Don't believe me? Look at these official schematics for the low proximity magnetic distortion system that go by during the third test. The answer was right in front of our face this entire time. The threshold is a bridged and stable null zone. This is why async researchers can enter and exit freely without being displaced in time and/or space. It also explains why Marvin thought the entrance to the red neighborhood was a null zone in pitfalls, not just because it led to an outside-looking area that Marvin thought was in standard, but also because Marvin was able to seamlessly pass through it.
The left hallway, and it's right there, under the gap in the wall. But what if Miller's right about the null zones?
Of course, we learn that it's just a gap in the wall to another area of the complex, but Marvin's speculation is a clue in itself as to what null zones are in the series.
In contrast, unstable null zones seem to appear randomly and can vary in size, as seen here in the null zone from Found Footage 2, Found Footage 3, and the video with that car clipping through the highway. But one thing that unstable null zones share is that they're prone to collapsing and pulling whatever is caught in its boundary inwards. Once that happens, the null zone seemingly dissipates, like it was never there in the first place.
This process also, unfortunately, displaces any wanderer who falls through them in space and time.
Ravi more than likely fell into the complex in 1997 given the discussion of the OKC bombing trial on the radio in the beginning of the video. Yet we see a poster from 2020 on the wall just before he enters the speaker room.
So, null zones are an entrance/exit to and from the complex. Cool. But what are they, then?
Given the context surrounding the low proximity magnetic distortion system as well as the schematics mentioning severe warping, I want to say that null zones are an event in space-time.
Now, I don't mean event as in like a party. Well, I guess maybe that could kind of apply. A space-time party in the complex does sound like it would be fun. But no, when I say event, I mean as it's defined in relativity.
In relativity, an event is anything that has a specific time and place in spacetime. For example, a glass breaking on the floor is an event. It occurs at a unique place and at a unique time. The notion of an event is an idealization, in the sense that it specifies a definite time and place, whereas any actual event is bound to have a finite extent, both in time and in space. This would mean that the severe warping in spacetime is an event.
So, with that in mind, if first contact caused an event in spacetime, then that would mean that overflow also caused an event in spacetime. Now, here's the really cool part.
An event in the universe is caused by the set of events in its causal past. An event contributes to the occurrence of events in its causal future, implying that first contact happened because overflow happened. Also, why do unstable null zones appear? I believe this is due to what happened in first contact. By permanently creating a severely warped event in spacetime, the resulting aftermath probably sent ripples across spacetime, creating copies of these warped events, which results in unstable, non-bridged versions of these null zones. They have nowhere to bridge to other than a random point within the complex.
It's like if you were to randomly throw a coin into a huge pit and you landed wherever that coin landed, whereas first contact was a more precise bridge. This also makes me wonder if the very concept of warped spacetime in an event is enough to displace someone in time if they were caught in a non-bridged version, aka any null zone that isn't the KV31 threshold. It would explain why people get displaced, as when spacetime unfurls, it more than likely catapults someone through time, which is what more than likely happened to Peter in informational video. So, to wrap it all up, the low proximity magnetic distortion system is an inertial confinement fusion reactor created to establish a bridged null zone into the complex. This bridged null zone allows async researchers to enter and exit the complex without being displaced through spacetime, and is more likely the reason for the unstable null zones popping up everywhere in the first place. This is also evidenced by the amount of missing people skyrocketing after the events of first contact, and is why we get our first appearance of a body in the complex on February 3rd, 1990. We know that the first iteration from Overflow caused Ivan's initial connection to the complex to be established, as the beginning and ending shots from Overflow seem to hint at some kind of permanent change to standard that gets worse as time goes on and seemingly peaks in intensity in I Remember. And it's even been theorized that a second, much wider threshold could cause unforeseen and drastic consequences for async and standard. What these consequences are remains to be seen, but hopefully we get some info from videos or the movie that helps put us in the right direction. I hope you all enjoyed my theory on what the low proximity magnetic distortion system is and how it connects to null zones and the sun. If you did, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as well as turn on notifications so you don't miss the next time that I upload or stream. I, of course, have been working on a very big video that you have no doubt seen by now, so I hope you guys also enjoy my smaller uploads of one-off theories or gameplay videos that I might be doing. Anyway, I hope y'all take care, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye! Again, why does it keep doing that?